I think we can make a start, no?
Je pense qu'on peut commencer, non?
Okay.
Bien,
All right. Welcome
bien.
everybody
Bienvenue à tous.
to this webinar. Welcome. Well, some of us are in Brussels, some of us are in Kenya, but I think it's afternoon everywhere. So welcome to this event on looking at whether rich countries are abandoning aid in 2025. Obviously, last week we saw the OECD announce deep cuts of about 7% to development aid spending budgets in 2024. And unfortunately, that appears to be the tip of the iceberg. As we've seen in the last couple of months, we've seen the suspension of US aid. And we have also seen successive European governments promise to slash their own development aid budgets. And with that in mind, the OECD last week forecast that we might see up to a 17% cut in aid budgets in 2025. So therefore, we have to ask ourselves, is aid under attack? And to address that...
Ben, can you hear me? Excuse me.
Yeah,
Would you wait
yeah,
just a second so we can assign the interpretation booth?
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. We had a slight, just getting everybody ready with the interpretation, which we have today in French, English, and Spanish. So joining me this afternoon, we have Jean Saldana, the director of Eurodad. We have Vitalis Medja, who is the executive director of ROA Africa. He will be followed by Tanya Cox, who's the director of Concord. And we also are joined by Abby Maxman, who is the president of Oxfam America. My name is Benjamin Fox. I'm the African editor at EU Observer, and I will be moderating this discussion this afternoon. And so with that in mind, with this question of is aid under attack, if I could hand the floor over to you, Jean.
Thanks a lot, Benjamin, Ben, and really nice to see so many people on this webinar, and it really is indicative of how pertinent and burning this subject is, I suppose. And we've seen it spread across our television screens, all sorts of media. The US aid closed down, and I think that's kind of been glaring at us. But in the background, and what the data shows that we are discussing this afternoon, is actually a number of other rich countries have also been cutting down on their aid budgets in 2024. Here in the EU, we've seen that the drops were significant, falling almost 8.5%, more than 8.5%. And unfortunately, in this situation, 5 years to the SDGs, we only see 4 countries, out of which only 3 EU countries that have hit the 0.7 target. And there has been a major drop on the kind of the average aid budgets of rich countries, DAC, members of the development assistance community of the OECD. The average now is 0.33%, which is a major drop from last year. And obviously, especially in Europe, where we see a growing narrative about the need for increasing defense spending, it is pertinent to compare how much countries have been spending or have been committing to spend on defense budgets as compared to development budgets. We see countries perform really well on their 2.7 NATO target. For instance, 24 of 32 members of NATO have already averaged above 2.0% to almost 2.71%. And 15 of them averaging around 2%. So that clearly shows actually that what we are seeing lacking right now is political commitment more than anything else. And that raises the question, basically, if there is this political commitment to kind of even sacrifice the very, very strongly held debt and deficit ceilings in Germany or the EU, what is preventing countries from doing the same for something as urgent as on development budgets?
Many thanks, Jean. Could I hand the floor over to you, Medja, for your opening remarks? And also, very quickly, Jean, you kept within the 5 minutes for opening speeches, so thank you very much. And Medja et al., if you could also keep within that as well, that would be great. Thanks, Medja. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And indeed, let me thank the organizers for this conference, because it's happening at a very opportune time. Particularly because we are currently preparing for the fourth Funding for Development conference, which is supposed to take place in about 2 months. And the current context is very tense, but also telling in terms of how we are really serious about addressing the financial development needs of developing countries and how we want to work with them in that journey. And I think the figures are particularly telling, given the fact that the direct flows that are heading towards developing countries is not only falling, but substantively falling, especially for sub-Saharan Africa, where, if you may remember that in 2023, the fall was by 11%. And now in 2024, it was positive by 4%. And now it's falling back to negative 2%. So you see the serious rip-off happening there, which is a major area of concern, especially given that most of these countries, especially with regard to their development budget, a big chunk of it, actually to the tune of 65%, is exclusively dependent on ODA, which is increasingly becoming very unpredictable. But even more alarming, that politically, we are seeing political leaders making statements to indicate that they intend to cut more, which should be an issue of concern, but also shows a serious lack of commitment or political commitment of the governments. You may remember, for example, in the UK, when Labour was campaigning, they wanted to create a law to entrench the meeting of 0.7, and then they come in, get into power, and then everything switches, and they want now to cut the ODM out to 0.3. So you see the rhetoric getting more vicious, and actually action following that, which is something that we need to be concerned about. But also it's a time for the rest of us, and especially for the citizens in the North, to start asking whether the politicians are mirroring what they really want, or they are mirroring what what the psyche is at the national level, but the people are not just courageous enough to say, which then calls for us as a society to start thinking about the serious civic development education that is needed to raise awareness of the population, to start putting a bit more political pressure on this agenda, so that it's not just us speaking, but everybody else is reflecting on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meja. Yes, plenty of food for thought already. Tanya, you have the floor, your perspective.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to be joining you today for this really important conversation. So Concord, as you may know, is based in Europe, but with sort of many of our members having sort of international reach, let's say. And so aid is one of the topics that's extremely important to us, and we do our annual Aid Watch report. And I will then be talking from a European perspective, because Concord is based in Brussels, so talking about EU and what EU has been doing in terms of its aid contributions. I think the simplest way to sum up the EU and member states' commitments to aid would be to say that they're conditional, they're fragile, and they're political. And I'll come back to each of those words over the course of the conversation. But we're not just talking about numbers here. And I think that's really, really important to get that out, because it's so easy to cite figures and to cite percentages and all that kind of thing, and they end up being a bit meaningless. So these are not just numbers. These are political decisions with consequences for millions of people's lives in the immediate future, never mind in the medium and the longer term. And yes, there have been absolutely huge cuts, and the EU is unfortunately also responsible for many of these cuts. And they started in 2023 already, and they're ongoing now, and they will continue throughout 2025. So we know that, you know, Belgium, France, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands. Okay, I'll add the UK into this. They're not obviously an EU member state, I recognise that, but the UK has always been, a big partner in contributing to overseas development assistance. Cut. Billions of dollars of assistance has been cut. And we were looking at the figures in the team, and we worked out that instead of this commitment of 0.7% of GNI being given in ODA, the EU member states combined 0.47%. So it may seem a little bit higher than that figure that Jean was citing earlier on, but it's absolutely disastrous. And of course, the cuts are then going to keep coming. And indeed, there's only 3 EU member states that are actually meeting that 0.7% of GNI target, as Jean mentioned. But I think that on top of the cuts, that's one thing that we're really worried about. But the next thing that we're really worried about is how EU member states are using their aid. So on what it's spent and whom it's serving. So for example, the EU institutions themselves, 53% of the total net ODA that they contribute goes to Ukraine. Now, nobody questions whether Ukraine needs support or not. Nobody. But does that necessarily have to come out of ODA? Especially when we think about the huge needs that other countries have around the world as well, and who are going to get much less as a result of this and the consequences that they'll be facing. The other issue that we have with the way EU reports its ODA is that they actually inflate the numbers. So they, in our opinion, in Concord's opinion at least, they report significant amounts of money as ODA, which hasn't even necessarily left the member state concerned. So here, one example is in donor refugee costs. This just shouldn't count as aid. I mean, I'm sure we're all very familiar with ODA and how one defines ODA, but the OECD DAC has been very precise in this. There are 4 criteria that need to be met. And one of them, which seems very, very obvious, is it must go to countries which are on the OECD DAC list of recipients. And to my knowledge, not a single EU member state is on that DAC list of recipients. So here we already have a bit of a significant problem. And maybe just to throw an idea out that we might like to come back to later on, one of these problems is that the OECD DAC is made up of, is a rich country club, basically.
Yeah.
So it's only the donors who are part of this and who are setting the rules. So of course they can set the rules that please them. And this is why things like the in-donor refugee costs get included as aid and then made these figures seem bigger. So even if the figures are drastic from our perspective, they're more drastic than the ones that we're citing because of things like including aid such as in-donor refugee costs. But I'll stop there in the interest of time, and then Ben, let's create a conversation between us. Thank you. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Tanya. Yes, no, I think this question about the OECD being the rulemaking body is something that we really we should revisit this afternoon, especially as I was one of the attendees at the last Financing for Development Summit in Addis Ababa in 2015, and I remember being told the UN tax convention is a pipe dream; it'll never happen. But it has, and perhaps this could be something that could happen for aid policy as well, that this could be set at UN. Yes, Abby, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. And following Tanya and others, obviously, I think there's interest in, I'll bring some of the US perspective, but I'd like to first start at a different level, following the others' really insightful opening remarks. And for us as Oxfam, I would say it's really fundamental when we talk about the estimated drops to contextualize them in a wider angle picture of framing these new aid figures that we know has already been a huge amount of stretch within the bigger picture of financing for development, as we've already touched on, in the context of a polycrisis. And I want to highlight three main elements here. One, extreme inequality and wealth concentration. This is a crisis in and of itself. The top 1% owning more wealth than 95% of all of humanity. That's part of the extreme inequality we're talking about, following on the discussions about who makes the rules. The second, these diverging global trends. While aid numbers drop, we have 3,000 billionaires amassing $16 trillion, 2 million more than last year. This is just being supercharged. And further, while we assume, or there's assumptions, and I think Tanya have already alluded to this, of the North kind of giving and the financial flow north to south, Oxfam's own numbers show that in 2023, the Global South is paying every hour over $30 million to the Global North richest 1%. Not to mention the debt crisis with 3 billion people living in countries where more is paid in debt interest than health or education. This came out into stark review during the pandemic and has really continued. And last, the multilateral system overall is in crisis. We cannot forget that the drop in aid is not only a crisis of development cooperation, and I think Meja already alluded to this, but a crisis of the multilateral system based in values and cooperation. And this is why 2025 is so important with the Finance for Development Conference, COP30, G20 hosted by the progressive governments, Spain, Brazil, South Africa. And the reason why we need this coalition of the willing to provide that moral leadership and leading by values of these three governments to transform multilateralism, financing for development, and fight against these inequalities and climate change, which is all supercharging the situation and the crisis. And, as already has been said, these numbers are just the anticipation of bigger drops ahead. And they're echoes, I guess we could look at it of a bygone world and era. Recognizing the US's role in this as the largest bilateral donor, we'll hopefully get to talk more about that. And these additional decreases that we'll continue to see. And so we really must not, this is about abandoning the very idea of international solidarity and cooperation and values. We have to come together. Saving lives is a good thing. We need to change that narrative. And as civil society, we have a crucial role to play. We need to work harder to convince and explain to an increasingly skeptical public and policymakers of why shifting these priorities are so dangerous for everybody and harmful for all. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Abby. I think we'll just take a first of 2 rounds of questions before we should then have about 15 minutes for questions for the audience. But Abby, first, obviously you're giving the perception perspective from the United States, and obviously we part of the reason why this this discussion is so pertinent and timely now is because the Trump administration has decided to shutter US aid. And the result of this, I mean, we also have the 90-day suspension of most US aid as well. What do you think the impact of this will be the world over, bearing in mind the the forecasts we saw from the OECD last week?
Well, I think we're already seeing how consequential it is. People are dying. The United States government, the Trump, Vance, Musk administration has taken a sledgehammer to, under the guise of so-called reform and efficiency, of things that required a scalpel. And the United States has gutted the premise of making the country stronger by or gutted development assistance under this guise of making the country stronger and safer. I think we've all witnessed that, calling it in the efficiency and eliminating waste. One could not find a more inefficient, wasteful, harmful, cruel, and immoral way of doing that. And the reality is that foreign assistance was already in the United States the most scrutinized spending in the budget in the U.S. And it was also just a tiny percentage of U.S. government spending. We have been trying to debunk that myth for decades to no effect, it appears, because it's less than 1% of U.S. government spending, and all for good. I mean, we all agree that reform is useful and essential, and we've all been fighting for that. But spending on foreign and that spending foreign assistance and ODA makes an enormous difference. And so we recognize the huge impact and adverse implications, not only of the US's withdrawal, but even worse, how they have come about it. In Oxfam, like everywhere, we are seeing the impact of these cuts on people's lives. Clinics closing down so that people with AIDS aren't receiving life-saving medications, lack of support for water, sanitation, hygiene in the context of outbreaks of cholera, disease prevention, control, food hunger. We all have been there, and we know it, we've named it, and we're trying to bring light to it. And the immediate impacts of having less funding for development are evident, and the longer term effects of stopping support for things like education, agriculture, good governance may appear more slowly, but we also know this is going to have long-term consequences. And of equally importance to these funding cuts are having on local organizations, local civil society in places where their work is most needed. And this falls in contrast to previous commitments by the US government and others, and things like the Grand Bargain and all sorts of global and US priorities that had made some progress by US and other DAC donors to shift power so that development and humanitarian interventions could be locally led and owned and most effective, we know. So what we're also throwing out is a huge body of knowledge, experience, expertise, and we are doing everything we can to fight against it, throw sand in the gears. And indeed, as Oxfam, we have joined a lawsuit, amongst other actions, to try to reverse those trends, knowing the far-reaching impact that pulling out 42% of the global humanitarian and development funding is having on global development, peace, security, and everything we all care about. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. And moving on to Tanya, I guess, I mean, we're all very aware of the headlines being grabbed by the Trump administration and Elon Musk, and whether it's and the dramatic kind of optics of the 3-month suspension and the shuttering of US aid. But let's be honest, a lot of EU countries have been slashing their aid budgets for several years. We have this year we have Germany and France, the EU's two main donors, announcing swinging cuts. We have the Dutch doing things a little bit more honourably, but even so, they're planning cuts, but they're just saying you've got 2 years to prepare for them. So I guess, why have EU leaders been able to slash aid spending with so little accountability and so little public pushback?
Thank you, Ben. Thanks a lot. We have been trying to hold them to account. We've been doing our utmost in civil society, but admittedly, we haven't been as successful as we would have liked. And that's clear. There's probably no one simple answer to that question. This is a real historical issue. Let's face it, countries have never, I mean, many countries, the majority of countries have never met that 0.7% commitment. And that 0.7% commitment has been put back and put back and put back. So there's been a problem right from the start. And I think we shouldn't forget that. So we have had moments where aid may have gone up, but there've been also plenty of times when levels of aid have gone down. I think now the big crisis that we're seeing, if you like, is the rise of maybe what we might loosely call these populist politicians who come out with these flamboyant, let's say, statements, which are completely full of misinformation. I mean, half the time just utterly false, and who do so partly to get the support of others. How do they do it? By creating fear and worry and concern about, for example, I mean, typical lines are, well, the migrants are taking your jobs. This is what we hear quite often from populist politicians like this. So they manage to put a spotlight like this in politics on certain issues like migration and therefore needing anti-migration measures, or on security and defence. I mean, Jean was already referring to this in her introduction, or on, for example, the importance of the EU member states, whichever country it may be, own interests, their own economic interests. And of course, when they manage to create a bit of a groundswell around this, it's then very hard for the other parties to say, oh, well, hang on, hold on a second. No, they feel they have to jump on a bandwagon, it seems, rather than just collectively pushing back. And this is where I think they started going wrong. But that mistake was made many years ago, not starting to push back hard enough on what these populist politicians were coming out with. So now they also have to show, no, we take these subjects very seriously as well. We're also worried about, your jobs, your future, our economic security, and so on and so forth. And we've got a sort of snowball effect, and a vicious circle in the process has been created. So we've got the public worried, the politicians are trying to respond to that, and it goes on like this. Now, the thing is, in actual fact, if you look at the Eurobarometer surveys, the Eurobarometer surveys show very clearly that there's a large part of the public that do support solidarity with others and the EU giving aid to its partner countries and supporting partner countries, their health systems, their education systems, social protection, and so on and so forth, helping their progress. There's a large part of the population that still does that. The question is how to reach them. And I think that's where we're all struggling a little bit at the moment, to be very honest. And there's a definite tendency and trend towards misinformation and contradiction between sources of information, which is just generally confusing for people. That said, the general public are not following this on a daily basis like we are. So, of course, that pushback won't come from the general public necessarily. It has to come from civil society and journalists like you, and academics and other such people. But this is why I started off by saying aid is such a political topic. And that's also why it's so fragile, because a series of lies can just break a system. And I think that's also, if I may, why we also need to be careful when we're talking about the aid system, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And we have to be very careful about that, because these people can also then latch on to what we're saying. Oh, well, if they're saying it doesn't work and nobody's doing what they should be doing anyway, well, let's just drop it all. No, that's not what we're saying at all. Aid does work. And it has, as you were saying, Abby, had a massive... Sorry, I'm going too fast. Apparently, my colleagues just told me I will slow down. I get excited about this. I'm passionate about it. But aid does save lives, and it does change people's futures. And this is why we now need to work together, I think, to see how we can communicate this more broadly so that politicians do understand this and then go back to it. But this is going to be a piece of work that we'll have to do in alliance, all of us together. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. I think it's every reason to get passionate and worked up about this. And as your point about I guess the fragility of aid, and I mean, this is one of the questions I would like to pose to you, Medja, is, I mean, there are real world consequences to these deep aid cuts. I mean, I think I, like Medja, I'm currently in Kenya, and the Kenyan government last month, I think the health ministry announced that it was reclassifying TB and HIV AIDS drugs. So basically they won't be free any longer. And this is partly because of, I think, an estimated $700 million hole in the national budget, in the healthcare budget this year because of the US cuts. So what will the real life consequences be, Medja? And also how do recipient countries adjust to this kind of very uncertain world where aid budgets can be slashed on a whim?
No, thank you very much, and very difficult question, but I shall try. Couple of things. I think the first thing we need to understand about aid, I mean, it's not really a charity, because it's. I mean, let's be factual here. Rich countries are doing business. So either using aid to create opportunities to do business, or use the ODA itself to buy influence, or spaces to either do mining and stuff. So it's not really charity. And for us, we think this is a very small part of a right that we think needs to be part of the equation. Now, I think for me, I find this behavior very disruptive and disconcerting, because you cannot, for the last 15 years, we've been arguing that we need countries in the South to own their own development plans and to develop them and bring them to certain quality and then support that. So for 5 years, when governments are doing budgeting or planning, they're also planning with part of that ODA system, and preparing that certain proportion is going to go to the budget to support the government system. So when you directly just pull out the resources like that without a clear plan, you disrupt the whole system. It is not just a 1 year, my 1 year, 3 month thing, but you disrupt the whole 5-year programming. And then you claim that they're not developing or they're corrupt. So there's a bit of issue there that we really need to be cognizant about. And here I usually push back and say, actually, Europeans should be, the continent. Europe should be the continent where they understand that ODA or assistance can transform the society, can transform the system. And the question we ask ourselves, if it supported the Marshall Plan and Europe got to where it was, why are you not able to bring that experience that you had to bear benefit or impact in the South? And I think by sheer behavior of simply cutting or freezing really tells you that the idea is not really to develop the countries, it's really to disrupt them. And that is something that we need to work out to get rid of. Now, to come straight to your question, I think immediate impact, some of those you've already said, because most governments have an annual budget plan. And with that, the ODA or aid is already factored in that budget. So the moment it's done, government has no option, because it cannot raise additional resources, but really to cut that particular component. And most of those resources, usually, as you're saying, go to either HIV/AIDS, or tuberculosis, or fighting malaria, or research that really go into promoting access to medicine that are very critical to life. And the moment you pull that out, basically that element or segment of the population, you basically throw them under the dog, to the other side of the world, which is something that for any, somebody who is humane, who understands the suffering and the gaps that those resources is going to create, need to think twice. And I feel that right now we are just treating these aid cards as numbers, but we are not putting human faces in them, and the implication of the services and opportunities those resources were creating. So I think we need to think carefully on how this plays out. Now, what should governments in the South do? I think for us, this is really a wake-up call. And one of the things we are saying at the national level is now we need to build on, at the country level, come up with country partnership principles, that you cannot allow a donor just to wake up one day and say, oh, I'm cutting aid, so get on with it. No. There has to be a clear arrangement and agreement that before you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 must be in place, so that it is predictable, it is respectful, but also respects sovereignty of those countries. Because the moment you are just allowed to behave the way you want, it becomes the law of the jungle, which we cannot operate that way. Secondly, is also the question of understanding that most of these countries, if not all, have signed on to the Right to Development Charter, where internationally it is recognized that partner countries or poor countries will do their development plan, and international resources will be mobilized to support these plans. And these have to be predictable. And I think at the moment, it has become a scenario where the rich meet, decide what they want to do, how they want to cut, and we just need to sit back and take it in. But I think it's time for a new ballgame, and that's why some of us, including Eurodad and others, have been saying, no, the governance framework, the rules that inform how much, when, and how needs a global structure to inform that, to determine that, and not just determine where it goes, but how and the quality of it and the quantity of it. So that if you want to call that as aid, certain parameters have to be met. Because right now, that is not just working. And we are leaving very many people unattended. The last point, if you allow me, because especially for Kenya now, as well that we are hosting very many refugees in the country, right? And this category of people, if you withdraw, who is going to take care of them? Who is going to address the Kakuma Camp problem and others? So there are these things that we really were not properly thought out, or we are not thinking about them carefully before we make certain decisions. And I think it is high time that we have that conversation and strengthen dialogue between, and so that we don't have this notion of recipient versus to supply versus demand, and making sure that they really meet the needs of the people who are on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Meja. No, I think that's this point that aid is not charity is a vital one. I mean, it's. I mean, yes, the amount of exploitation that we still see from a number of wealthy countries in developing states. And I'm just thinking about I've been covering the EU's minerals agreements that it's been striking with Rwanda, Congo, several other countries. These are purely about geopolitical interests. We should be honest about that. And Tanya, I guess, what, from your perspective and based on what we saw last week with the OECD announcement on aid, what are the main kind of key trends that you have identified over the past 12 months, and what are we likely to see in terms of aid budgets and aid spending going forward? And what do these trends reveal about the priorities of wealthy countries? Also, I know you wanted to come in about the question of debt repayments, and another quick question. I mean, it's been alluded to from our audience, is we do seem to have a kind of a governance failure when it comes to aid. We have the OECD itself is a rich person's club, and with no kind of voices from developing countries. How can we reform this?
Did you intend that question for me or for Jean?
Oh, sorry, for Jean. Apologies.
Thought so. Okay, over to you, Jean.
Yeah, no worries, Ben. Thanks a lot for those questions. I think a lot of very important points have been raised by Abby, by Tanya, and by Major, and I'd like to respond to all of them, kind of especially, and I'm glad that all three have kind of re-emphasized the importance of the issue of who makes the rules on ODA, the issue of governance, and basically whether kind of DAC members or any rich countries feel accountable for those rules, and how do we act on that issue of accountability? What Tanya said is very correct. Civil society has been putting a lot of pressure, has been raising awareness for many years, but unfortunately, we are in a situation which we are in, and what can we do about it? That's the kind of the key question for this afternoon. But before that, I mean, I'm really glad that Abby pointed to the polycrisis. We are in a polycrisis, and I mean, this is an important kind of context that we have to set this discussion in. In a polycrisis that we are in today, can we afford the kind of state of aid that we are in today? And I absolutely agree with Tanya that we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because there are problems with governance and accountability does not mean that aid is not working. And if we look at what the media is covering, and I think it's very, very eye-opening to see the immediate impacts of the aid cuts, especially US aid shutting down, and the direct impacts that we are having. If you look at the aid figures, for instance, if we see the amount of aid that goes to countries and compare it to the amount of money that those countries are paying in debt, I mean, it's not at all fair. It's an unethical situation. And I mean, unfortunately, of course, these are last year's figures. Only recently, we have received reports that, for instance, Malawi, which was very, very dependent on US aid, is going to be spending much more than half of its budget now on repaying its debt, and cannot afford to spend it's basically what it has what it's supposed to be spending on public services, including health and education, because of that, because it was so dependent on aid to be able to finance that while being able to honor its debt payments. It's just unethical, the situation. I think it's also important to acknowledge quality issues, and as you say, Ben, unfortunately, rather than development commitments, we see more and more motivations around aid spending driven by geopolitics and also economic interests. Tanya was very correct in saying that. For instance, we've seen new rules on counting private sector investments in ODA, and as a result of that, more and more money going to development finance institutions or to underwrite investments as being counted as ODA, which is also a problematic situation because the question is, who does that finally benefit? We also see a lot less concessional aid and a lot less money that is given as grants. And that is, again, problematic in a situation where we have many more countries in a debt crisis than more than 20 years ago. So these all demonstrate, unfortunately, and this is, again, 2024 figures, the fact that what we see in the situation of aid absolutely does not match up with the reality of what aid should be doing and can do in the world today to address the polycrisis. And that, I suppose, brings me to the point that that I wanted to raise on the issues of governance. Absolutely, what the other panelists have said, it is a failure of governance. So far, what we've seen are rules that have been shaped within the OECD DAC to basically suit their interests. And the fact is that the DAC is a group of peers, a group of donors, and you do not have the partner countries, the countries on the recipient side, basically being able to be at the table to also form the rules together at the same level. Then you also have the issue of accountability, which is the other side of the coin. You have basically rich countries who are monitoring themselves, reporting, which is great. But essentially, there is just peer pressure and soft peer pressure. There is no hard accountability, as for instance, you would see in climate change, where you have all the countries sitting together. And even if countries are going back on their climate finance commitments or not very ambitious, they are being called to task. They're being called to task by other members of the convention, as well as by the public. And I think what we really need is to have that kind of a level playing field. And that is what we are asking for, a new governance in which all countries can sit around the table with an equal voice to shape the rules and ask for accountability. And we believe that the UN can provide this space. And the upcoming Financing for Development conference in Sevilla is a once-in-a-decade opportunity. It's 10 years after Addis. And Ben, you started with this when you said, indeed, things can change very, very quickly. And we've seen that in the tax area of financing for development. We had a group of countries, the African group of countries, who had kind of the ambition and who have put the issue of a UN tax convention on the agenda. And things have moved forward, despite the fact that there has been not so much of constructive support from the global north. The US has stepped out of the negotiations, but that negotiation continues forward. And I think that is an important inspiration and an important indication that these kind of discussions can and should happen in the UN space.
Thanks, Jean. Yes, no, I mean, I remember very vividly back in 2015 talking to politicians in Addis, and I think also talking with you know, Eurodad and other NGOs and politicians saying, look, this is just this UN tax convention idea, it's just a distraction. And point one and point two, it'll never happen. But we saw, you know, with the Africa group, and we've seen now for kind of, I think about 18 months now, the Africa group at the United Nations really kind of taking ownership and driving this process forward. And it is happening despite, yeah, as you said, the opposition from the US and kind of ambivalence, if we like, from Europe. I guess just moving on from that, I have a question for, I think I'd like to pose it to Tanya and then and Abby, is, do you think that the OECD DAC has kind of presided over a kind of a devaluation of aid and what it should be? You mentioned the kind of in-donor refugee costs. Should these be counted as aid? We've seen the same, you know, changes to the rules on how migration policies can count as aid. Should we be focusing more on quality than quantity, and how could we do this? Tanya and then Abby, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Ben. Both are obviously important. So I don't think that we should be choosing between quantity and quality, but when you're talking about the quality isn't there, then of course it undermines the quantity. So they really do go together. But maybe I can start where you started. Has the OECD DAC presided over a devaluation of aid? I think that rich countries have basically created an institution, if you like, in their own image, following, neo-colonial tendencies, and they are continuing to exploit while also trying to maybe assuage any guilt complexes they probably don't have, but by giving also aid. We've all mentioned the fact that more money is actually coming out. We shouldn't be talking about aid, more money, just in terms of money. More money is coming out from the exploitation of resources and other things in most countries than is going in. Jason Hickel cited a figure or calculated a figure of for every dollar actually going in aid to a partner country, actually $30 are coming out. This, for me, undermines the very concept of giving aid. And that in a way is what makes, I think, aid seem like charity for some, but in actual fact for us, it should be reparations. This is paying reparations. This is what the EU and others owe because of everything they've taken out from other countries, how they've exploited other people and other countries' resources. So yes, they've devalorized aid, but they've also completely warped it. And they're now using it for their own purposes, which for me is a double whammy in terms of absolutely unacceptable things. I mean, if you look at, for example, the Global Gateway, I know we don't have much time left, but if you look at the EU's Global Gateway initiative, which is this huge infrastructure, major projects in energy and transport and all the rest of it, you mentioned it for the minerals deal. Well, this falls under the Global Gateway umbrella, if you like. This is all about making sure the EU secures its own economic future, its own resources, its own stability, and so on and so forth. But what is it doing? It's using ODA. Quite a lot of ODA money is used for these global gateway projects and then would be counted presumably as ODA. I'm sorry, but this is just not this just doesn't align with the definition, even of the OECD DAC. So, I mean, there are a whole lot of problems that I think need to be worked out. And to be very honest, I think we need to go back to the drawing board now. And I think we need to say, stop. Let's create something completely new and let's start afresh using completely different terminology. I mean, we hear about things like, for example, the global public investment, or we could have a global investment fund, or we can create whatever we like with a completely new name, but where everybody's at the table. And this is where I think we're all agreeing in terms of the panelists. Everybody needs to be at the table to decide how that money is used. Because at the moment, if you look at things like the Global Gateway, it is definitely not the case that the EU is discussing all these projects with its partner countries, despite the fact that it's pretending to invest in them for their future and so on and so forth. And this is what really undermines, I think, the very idea of aid or assistance or even just cooperation, because this is how we should be looking at it. We should be looking at it as cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks. Abby, should we rebuild the whole thing from scratch? And and also what can civil society do about this?
Well, yeah, I appreciate coming on the heels of Tanya. I was sort of plus oneing actually what Medja and Jean also said. And we're in this moment where even the quality quantity, these are not discussions we want to have, but it is a reality. There's a forcing function. And, this notion of rewiring and rebuilding what we know we need, a fairer, more just, equal system, while also protecting people's lives. It is so immoral. And, the United States is, what it has done to upend things in such a dramatic and cruel way cannot be overstated. I'll just leave that there. But, when we look at the effects that the funding cuts are having on local civil society in places where their work is most needed, it's immoral, it's unethical, and we need to do something different. And as Tanya and others said, the US and other DAC donors, there were efforts. Were efforts to make slow but steady progress about inclusion and shifting power for development and humanitarian interventions to be more locally led and more effective. And yet the progress has declined. And now it has been really undermined completely. So we have to do these two tracks at the same time. We have a duty, a moral duty to have the quality with the quantity that we can protect, to do as much good as possible to save lives and livelihoods. But we know that that is under threat, but we can't abandon that while we rework and rewire a whole new system, even though both things need to happen. We are living at a foundational moment for multilateralism, and it really is time to not protect it in its current form, but to reimagine it, strengthen it, revamp it, and make it more inclusive. And 2025 has to be the moment. There's too much at stake, and that's why we know the coalition of the willing, led by Brazil and South Africa and Spain, to defend and transform it right now is so essential. Finance for development, COP30, G20, all the things, these big moments, and even this week, I'd say, and here in the U.S. in Washington with the IFI, the spring meetings. But nonetheless, we need these coalition of the willing. We need an active civil society everywhere to fight against this highly unequal, unfair, unjust set of systems. Huge amount of learning. Medja, everybody has talked about it. And it is really in times of uncertainty that we are the ones in civil society and the coalitions that care so deeply and have so much knowledge and experience and evidence that we can do things right and do the right thing, and giving directionally and contributing to these global conversations about how multilateralism needs to be rewired and be built, not thrown out to get to that point of baby in bathwater. No, there's been incredible things that have been done, and we can't neglect that while we try to rebuild this new system. So we have a huge role to play. Stay active, stay involved where we sit. Collaboration, cooperation cannot be undermined. And some of the good progress that we know existed and the good principles and values, we must hold on to them, but rethink our strategies and tactics to be more effective for the new world we're living in.
Thanks, Abby. And I do think you've not really mentioned the role of journalists too much, but yes, I mean, we are obviously, I have been, following the UN Tax Convention, following aid, and we actually know that certainly from EU Observer, the viewing numbers are very good. People are interested. There is a captive audience, and we do need to keep pushing. Because as you say, these cuts are immoral, aside from being extremely stupid and short-sighted, because aid is a vital, in terms of soft diplomacy, there are a few things more effective. I'm aware of time. We are going to run another couple of more minutes, another 3 minutes past the hour. I'd just like to bring in Medja and Jean and for final comments. Your take on what Abby and Tanya have just said. But sorry, I have my 18-month-old, as I knew this would happen. He's gate crashed. Apologies. So to Medja and Jean, how do we know aid is important and about its value and the kind of diplomatic power that it has. How do we communicate its importance with a public that's, one, weary, and also that is being told by politicians that in order to pay for increased defense spending, we have to cut aid? And also, how can we kind of better align ODA with country priorities to be more efficient? Thanks. Jean and then Medja, please.
I think that the alignment agenda is not a new agenda, has been in discussion, has been pushed by recipient countries for many, many years. And you had, if you remember, the Paris Agreement that came after, that whole discussion on aid effectiveness. But again, it comes back, and it always comes back to the issue of who sets the rules and who are donors accountable to. I think as long as donors set their rules to their own convenience, and we've seen kind of the recent evolution of DAC rules, ODA rules around private sector instruments as the most recent indication of that. As long as they set the rules, they'll set the rules to their convenience and not to the demands of and to the needs and the necessities of kind of development effectiveness in general, but specifically the needs of countries where ODA plays such an important role. And Meja will obviously come in on that. But I mean, how do we address this issue in Europe? How do we speak to the public? As Tanya said, I don't think that support for ODA has flailed. I just don't think that is getting as much prominence as it deserves to get. I mean, I think it is a question of media, definitely, but it's also a question of what is the zeitgeist. If you look at what's going on in Europe right now, I mean, the public is made to believe that, and I mean, there is this perception, you know, that defense budget spending is absolutely essential, and the EU has lifted its penalties around deficit spending, so that, you know, countries, even though, like in Belgium where I live, they're deeply in debt, they can kind of really step up their defense spending to be able to achieve the new rearm targets that Europe has. And the public a case is made to the public that this is absolutely necessary. The question is, when we are living in a polycrisis, and it's unconscionable how, you know, development, even 0.7 of it, can have such a major impact. I mean, 0.7, compare that to 2%. It's a small drop compared to that. If countries basically can convince their public that it is justified to spend over 2% on guns and on armies, how can we not convince the public that a tiny percent, less than 1%, is necessary, basically also for global stability in a time where you have the majority of the world with very, very young populations, which right now in 2025 have a very, very bleak outlook in terms of the investments that their countries can make. I mean, if you look at that as a kind of a stability issue, as a risk issue, I think that a case can be made that, you know, spending on development solidarity and development effectiveness is as acute as spending on defense. And that's why I think that it is a huge opportunity, and FFD4, the Financing for Development Conference here in Europe, provides us a huge opportunity for us to speak about this. And I think that's what we are going to be doing in a big way. We have a campaign starting very soon targeting young people to speak about that.
No, thanks very much, Jean. And yes, we are running pretty close to being out of time. Meja, if you could make your remarks, and then I think we will have to wrap up. And thank you very much to our audience, substantial audience, for their questions, which I've tried to integrate in the last 20 minutes. Meja, you have the floor.
No, thank you very much. And I align myself with the statements that fellow panelists have said. I think on the question of quality versus quantity, it isn't either or. Because if you are giving so much money and you're behaving badly, the money goes to waste. And here, I mean, the issue of accountability really comes up, because when it comes to the quality issue, I think we've sorted those out. The principles are there. The targets of what countries are supposed to do are clear for everyone to see. But it's really how we hold each other to account to that. And I think rich countries are not doing their part. And now to make it worse, the question of cutting ODA. But I think Tanya was a bit shy. Indeed, donors become major they have become major consumers of their own ODA. I mean, if you look at the internal refugee costs and all that, and even if you're talking about security, I don't expect that security will only be spent in Europe. I suspect some of that will be ferried into Africa to try also to bolster and strengthen their interests there. And so if we're not careful, we are going into a very dark era where military spending will be the norm and development agenda will really be on the fringe. So it's something that we have to be very conscious about, that when we are moving towards military expenditure, you are also militarizing the state in another way. And it will not just be in the West, it will also be in the South, and there goes democracy. I think the second point, which I really share with what Jenna said, is the question of, and I think Abby also said this is a political issue. And we need to now accept as civil society that we are in a political field, that we are not in policy space anymore. And we are fighting for the mindsets of the population. So we need to invest a bit more resources in mobilizing the community, in mobilizing the youth, so that they put the political pressure, because that's the only thing that politicians understand. I remember when we were doing the debt campaigns in the 80s and in the 90s, that is what pushed them. Nobody ever thought they would come up with a debt relief. But now, I mean, after the pressure, that happened. So it's really time for us now as ODA people, guys who want improvement in development cooperation, to really now bring that conversation to the communities, to the classrooms, to the streets, so that it doesn't appear a technical issue, but really a normal, ordinary issue that we know affects development. And it's not just development for the Africans or the Asians or whatever. It's development for the whole world. Because when these guys are strong, the people in the South are strong, Europe gets stronger, the world gets to be a better place. So it's also really making sure that we ring-fence this resource to perform specific purpose, to really give dignity to people in the South, so that it not really, I mean, we know it will not take over, but it will contribute to that. And lastly, this is really an opportunity for African governments, Asian governments, and governments of the South in general to really exercise that leadership and ownership of what their priorities are, and really outline how any other resource that comes out that is not aligned to that, they tell them, this is not working. And that also calls for them to really budget and finance essential components that largely should not disrupt in a big way people's livelihoods or access to essential medicine. I stopped there, and for me, really, the question of rich abandoning ODA is not really a question that we should be grappling with, especially now, given what we know is happening. It's really a question for us to start saying that this is the time to act right, especially with the freezing of the USA aid. It's the time for other development partners to step up and fill the void, so that the USA can feel ashamed and say, we made a mistake here, we want to come back. Otherwise, if you start feeling sorry and everybody's coiling back into their cocoons, we are not going to get it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Major. Yeah, no, I think yes, this is we are in the midst of I think a fight for kind of about this. We have to win this battle of narratives about the importance of aid, and the fact that yes, this is not charity. This is something. This is a policy tool that is one of. I mean, various studies have suggested it's one of the most efficient bits of government spending, pound for pound, euro for euro, dollar for dollar of all. We have run significantly over time, so we have to wrap up. And I would like to say it's been a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I thank you very much to our audience, and particular thanks to our four speakers this afternoon, to Tanya Cox from Concord, Vitalis Major from Reality of Aid Africa, Abby Maxman from Oxfam America, and Jean Saldana, director of Eurodad. Thank you very, very much for your contributions. I think this has been a hugely important discussion, and one which I will continue to cover as a reporter. And thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
Ben. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.